Welcome, everyone. This is the third class exploring the book Death and After by Annie Besant. So today we are going to look a little more in detail the experience in Devachan. So let us proceed now to look more carefully to what kind of experience the soul has in this state or plane of existence that is called Devachan. So Annie Besant begins by saying nature gives to each in Devachan the satisfaction of all pure desires. See that whenever there is talk about Devachan, there are these words: pure, spiritual, noble. So because as we have seen in previous classes, the experience in Devachan is based on sensations, feelings, thoughts, intentions, aspirations, desires that have to do in some way or the other with the spiritual, that are on the side of love, let's say, on the side of a certain sense of connection, a certain recognition of the more spiritual as opposed to just the physical material existence. And then she quotes a master of wisdom who said, the bliss in Devachan is complete. It is an absolute oblivion of all that gave it pain, gave it, the soul or the Devachani, the complete oblivion of all that gave it pain or sorrow in the past incarnation, and even oblivion of the fact that such thing as pain or sorrow exists at all. And so this is why many religions, when referring to heaven, paradise, etc., they describe this as a state of bliss. Now, this is not only true for souls who disembodied, souls whose physical bodies die. This is true for any person, whether in a body or outside of the body, who is able to be aware on this plane. The Devachanic plane is a plane of consciousness in nature. And in deep meditation, it's not that easy, it's not that common, but in deep meditation, we can reach the Devachanic plane. That is, we can reach the level of the soul. And this is exactly the experience, even if we are incarnated at the time. The experience on the Devachanic plane is one where there is only bliss, there is understanding, there is peace, there is truth, and no negatives can even enter the conception of consciousness on the Devachanic plane. And negatives in the sense of a sense of being tired doesn't exist there. A sense of being separate doesn't exist. A sense of lack or desire doesn't exist. A sense of even, future longings for future things doesn't exist. On the Devachanic plane, whether we reach it helped by nature after we die, or we reach it in meditation, on the Devachanic plane, there is no possibility to anything that is negative, simply because what we call negative belongs to the lower nature, to the more material aspect. All those negatives are a function of matter, let's say, not of spirit. Of course, in the Theosophical view, spirit and matter are in each plane. They are two sides of the same coin. So I'm using spirit and matter, allegorically speaking, in a general way. Therefore, when we are on the spiritual planes, we have left behind the causes of sorrow, which only belong to the lower planes, and there is only the experience of bliss, etc. This is our true nature. This is what we have to understand. It's difficult for most people, being so identified as we are with the lower nature. It's difficult for us to realize, even if intellectually, that this is what we are. Our true nature is one in which there is no room for lack, for sorrow, for anything. That is who we are. Then when we incarnate, we forget that, and we identify with aspects of nature which are limited, and by necessity, they are sources of sorrow. As a soul, we don't have a body that dies. Therefore, we don't have a body that can be hurt. We don't have a body that can be tired. Therefore, it's illness, tiredness, fear of death, hurt, all those things, they just belong to the body. If you don't have a body, those things don't exist for you in your consciousness. Similarly with emotional pain, sorrow, worry, etc., they belong to the emotional body. Same thing to the lower mind, the concrete mind, anxiety, pride, this and that, they all belong to the lower mind. So none of this exists. Now, when we die, we are helped by nature. Nature is like nature gets rid of all these sources of pain, of sorrow, gets rid of that for us. But in the process of evolution, we have to learn to put them aside at will. And this is what happens as we learn to raise our consciousness in meditation, for example. Meditation is a process similar to death, in which temporarily we leave behind the physical body, we forget about the body, then about the emotions, then about the mind, and then we can become aware in this state of bliss that is our true nature. So keep in mind that when you study a description of the devachanic plane, this is not just a state, an artificial state that you are for the time being somewhere in some heaven to come back to your normal state that is being incarnated. It's the opposite. This description is a description of your true nature. And Besant says there on the devachanic plane, Manas exercises, Manas is the mind, exercises that faculty of his innate divinity that he never wills in vain. She's quoting this from somewhere, but the idea here is that there is the concept that whatever thoughts we generate, they are bound to shape reality according to those thoughts at some point on some plane. An oversimplification of this view is that we can think something and immediately change the physical world. And the physical world is very difficult to change. The physical world is the one that is more dense, more solid, and you really need to be a yogi and develop to the fullest extent your latent faculties to be able to change the physical plane. Fortunately, we cannot change the physical plane so easily with our thoughts, as some modern traditions suggest. Otherwise, the world would be far more a chaos than it is. We see in social media, for example, what kind of world we have when people can't just materialize their thoughts easily. Imagine if that was true on the physical plane, then the world would be, as I said, far more of a chaos than it is. The physical plane is quite difficult to change, although it is possible when we develop the full potentiality of our powers. However, our thoughts are constantly shaping how we perceive the physical world. Our thoughts are shaping our inner bodies, emotional and mental, and our thoughts are shaping our experience in Devachan, and all of these, our thoughts will shape what kind of incarnation we will have in the future. So it is true that our thoughts are creative. Whatever we will, eventually is manifested, but in a far more nuanced or complex way than the simplistic thought that we can just change physical matter by thinking, again, unless we are a yogi. And Besant quotes, continues with a quote from the master that says, the Devachani lives its intermediate cycle, the intermediate state between two incarnations, surrounded by everything it had aspired to in vain. Let's stop there for a second. So we are in Devachan surrounded by everything we have aspired to in vain. There are many, especially perhaps to be more specific, everything spiritual that we have aspired in vain. And take the word spiritual in a wide sense. Aspirations that are not concrete, not physical, as we explained before, the earnest desire of a scientist to understand nature, the earnest desire of an artist to understand the laws of beauty and how to manifest them, the earnest desire of a philosopher to understand the universe. All that is part of what, of trying to perceive nature in its more spiritual aspects. Then expressions of love, then expressions or desires to help humanity, to help produce a change in society, in your family, in the organization you belong to. All these kind of aspirations that cannot be fulfilled because of the limitations that the physical body brings. Again, the idea that we are gods that can manipulate physical life to follow our whims is not really true on a practical level. It is in the long run, as I explained, but the physical plane is a shared reality where our wishes are only one among many. The whole cosmos is coming together to generate the physical plane. Therefore, there are limitations on the physical plane that we simply cannot escape, just in the same way that we cannot jump physically to the moon. There are many things that no matter how much we try, we are not going to be able to do on the physical plane in this incarnation. But all those aspirations are not in vain. All those aspirations actually, especially when these are aspirations for spiritual stuff, if it is the aspiration to have power or have possessions or this or that, karma will bring the possibility of us acquiring this in future incarnations. Whenever you see a person that has some kind of power and that person misuses that power, whatever the power is, money, time, intelligence, strength, political position, whatever it is, many times we see people who have some kind of power and they are completely, let's say, unable to use that in the correct way. That is because that person desired that for perhaps many incarnations, and everything we desire, we will get. Now, far from being a blessing, when we get something, some kind of power, let's say, again, power in a wide sense, and we misuse it, then we generate bad karma for us that, is really a curse rather than a blessing. Karma that if we had been humbler, we would not have to face perhaps for many incarnations in the future. So anything we desire that is material that can be accomplished on the physical plane will be given to us in future incarnations. But all those other things that we aspire in vain, maybe we have a relative in our family that we love, but it's very difficult to relate to this relative. Or it's very that relative chooses a way of life that is harmful for himself or herself, and all are suffering trying to help and being unable to help. All of this becomes the seeds for our experience in Devachan, where we can actually experience a life devoid of all those limitations that did not allow us to experience again life as we wanted it. So all that pain for this relative, in Devachan, we will have the opportunity to relate to that relative soul to soul. All those aspirations of generating a change in the world, generating some kind of activity that can help the world, all that can be done in Devachan. And that actually has an impact on the physical plane, as we are going to see. So basically, the idea here is that everything, as the master says, everything that we have aspired to in vain, in connection to something spiritual, something on the side of love, on the side of the abstract that is not physical, we will have a full reach a fulfillment in connection to that when we are in Devachan. Now, Besant says, according to the Orthodox Christian view, death is a separation, and the spirits of the dead wait for reunion until those they love also pass through death's gateway. So this is the typical belief in Western countries in general, or people who belong to Western religions, that you are going to see your loved one after you die. Suppose a loved one died, and then he or she is waiting there until you die, and then you will reunite with him or her after you die. Now, Besant says the esoteric philosophy teaches that death cannot touch the higher consciousness of the human being, and that it can only separate those who love each other so far as their lower vehicles are concerned. Remember, we have a lower nature and a higher nature. The lower nature is our mind, emotions, body. The higher nature is our soul, our spiritual nature. So Besant says here, from the point of view of the esoteric philosophy, death can separate us only at the level of the lower nature, but death cannot touch our relationship at the level of souls. As she says, while the person that is living on earth, blinded by matter, feels separated from those who have passed onwards, the Devachani, the soul in Devachan, says H.P. Blavatsky, having left behind all those vehicles over which death has power, has a complete conviction that there is no such thing as death at all. Therefore, to its less blinded eyes, its beloved are still with it, with the soul, with the Devachani. So death has only power to produce this illusion of separation at the level of the lower nature. As long as we are experiencing the world through the lower nature, when the body of that person that we love disappears from the physical plane, if my perception is limited to the physical plane, then obviously there is the sense of loss. I cannot, as a body, communicate, relate to another body because the body is gone. However, at the level of the soul, there is no separation because the soul doesn't need the body to communicate with other souls. We will look at this more carefully as we proceed. But those who have the ability to at least have an intuitive feeling, connection with their own souls, they can recognize the connection that still exists with the loved one. People who have a spiritual nature many times can feel that even though they miss the physical presence of a loved one, they can still feel a connection, a sense of inner connection, a sense of presence with them of the loved one. And this is an intuition that is coming to the brain consciousness of a real experience that is happening at the level of the soul. If we were able to raise our consciousness to the level of the soul, we would experience the full and even fuller relationship we have with our loved ones on the higher planes, fuller than whatever relationship we can have on the lower planes. Most of us cannot retain a clear memory of that, but we can have that feeling, that silent sense of connection, of still being somehow in the presence of the other person, is an echo, a reflection in the brain of a real experience at the level of the soul. So we don't need to wait until we die to be with people that we love. We never leave people that we love on the higher planes. So she says the ego, the soul, in Theosophy, remember ego with a capital E is a synonym for the soul. Ego just means I-ness. So this ego is the higher ego, the higher sense of I-ness, which is not like the personal ego. So the ego in Devachan enjoys the presence of their beloved in the one personal aspect held by him or her in this incarnation for as long as the desire for that presence remains. Remember that we said in our previous class, even though as souls, we are not our personalities. I, as a soul, am not Pablo. I have very little to do with this personality that is called Pablo. In my previous incarnation, that personality was called a different way. It had a different gender, coming from a different culture. And in my next incarnation, it will be the same. So I, as a soul, you as a soul, are independent on the particular, personality, character that we are acting at the moment, the role that we are, personifying at the moment. However, as we saw, Devachan is still part of the illusion in the sense that it is a continuity of the personal life. We as souls are still veiled by the most spiritual aspect of our previous personality. So when we are, as a soul, are connected to the soul of somebody that we love, we are actually connecting to them through the veil or the mask of the kind of relationship that we had on earth. As we progress, when that last veil falls, then we can recognize the soul of each other, let's say, in its full glory with no limitations. And there is the possibility of a union that is even deeper than the union that we have in the Devachan, and far deeper than any kind of union and connection we have on the physical plane. So as long as we are in Devachan, we are still conditioned by the previous personality. And Blavatsky says, we are with those whom we have lost in material form, if we as Devachanis, and far, far nearer to them now than when they were alive. And it is not only in the fancy of the Devachani, as some may imagine, but in reality. For pure divine love is not merely the blossom of a human heart, but has its roots in eternity. So there is always this sense that in Devachan we are far nearer than we can on the physical plane. And Besant says, as a matter of fact, because some people, as Blavatsky says, It's not imaginary. Some people may think that it's imaginary because all this is happening on the mental plane. Devachan is a state of consciousness on the mental plane. And they may have the sense that this is all happening in the mind of the person. And Besant says, as a matter of fact, all that we know on the physical plane of our friend, while we both are embodied, is the mental image caused by the impressions he makes on us. This is just a scientific fact. When we relate to something, somebody, or when we perceive an object or anything, see, for example, you are watching the screen of your computer. What are you really perceiving? You are really perceiving just vibrations, electromagnetic vibrations, which is the light that is coming from the screen. These vibrations have no particular color, no particular form. They are just vibrations. Theosophical teachings would say vibrations in the ether. And those vibrations may be some very slow, some others may be, with a higher frequency. They are just different kinds of vibrations. They come to our eyes. They stimulate cells in our eyes that begin to generate an electric current by means of exchanging ions from inside to the outside of the cell. That produces an electric current. Again, electric currents is just a movement of electrons. They don't have any form, they don't have any color, they don't have anything. They go to the neurons and they generate a pattern, an electric pattern, that is interpreted by the brain and then by the mind with the image that you see on the screen. So what you are actually perceiving is the image that your mind is creating out of the vibrations, the formless vibrations that are coming from the world. So we are always relating to mental images of everybody and everything. This is why there are some traditions that say everything is mind. In the Yogacara tradition of Buddhism, for example, the idea that this is just mind perceiving vibrations, but everything is happening within the mind. So this is what Annie Besant says. After all, everything we perceive is only inside of your consciousness. It's a mental image. And for us, it feels, it's not that it's invented. There is something out there. But that something, again, is a form of consciousness that our senses translate in the way that, that we perceive. Animals that have different senses, they see the world differently. Aliens, let's say, a humanity that is living in another planet may have a completely different way of perceiving their physical plane. So Annie Besant says, to us, even though we are really just perceiving the mental image that appears in us, our friend lacks nothing in objectivity. And then she says, a similar image is presented to the consciousness of the Devachani, and to him lacks nothing in objectivity. As the physical plane friend is visible to an observer on earth, on the physical plane, so is the mental plane friend visible to an observer on that plane. So in Devachan, there is no sense of hazy reality, imagination. The mental world in Devachan is as real and objective as the physical world is for us here. Now, she says, this union, being on the plane of the ego, on the plane of the soul, not on the physical plane, is free from all the sufferings which are inevitable on the physical plane, with all its illusory and transitory joys and sorrows. So there is a big difference that I mentioned at the beginning. On the plane, on the Devachanic plane, there is no room for misunderstandings. Misunderstandings come from the inability of the lower minds and the brains that have to express the lower mind, the inability of the mind/brain to communicate correctly what the person is thinking or feeling, etc. There is no possibility of selfishness. As souls, we are not selfish. There is nothing selfish in the soul. Selfishness comes with the mental body, the emotional body, the physical body. There are no, at the level of the soul, there are no needs. It's all a pouring out of love and connection. Physical needs come with the physical body, which is incomplete and needs certain things. The emotional body, which is also incomplete and requires from the environment certain things, with the mental body, etc. So on the Devachanic plane, there is a perfect harmonious relationship because, again, we are communicating from a plane where all the lacks, all the aspects of our nature that have a lack have been left behind. Now, while in Devachan, that communication is not, it is completely devoid of sorrow, but it's not perfect simply because it's not full. We are relating to the other soul, as I explained, with the veil of the last personality. So, after I die, I may feel that I am a very spiritual version of Pablo that is in touch with another soul, but I see that soul as my wife or my family or my friends. So there is a limitation because we are relating, let's say, with the sense of wife and husband. When the illusion of the Devachan is transcended, there is a relationship with the soul in a far fuller way, with all the different kind of relationships that we may have generated in many lifetimes, and with the deep sense of unity that all souls have. So even though the relationship at the level of the Devachanic plane is absolutely devoid of sorrow, it can be yet fuller than that once we transcend the illusion of Devachan. So another aspect that is obvious from what I described is that Besant says, while the Devachan is surrounded by its beloved in the higher consciousness on the Devachanic plane, he's not agonized by the knowledge of what they are suffering in the lower consciousness held in the bonds of flesh. So as I mentioned in the previous class, suppose Blavatsky will give this example. Suppose a mother dies and then her children are still alive. In Devachan, the mother will be in touch with her children, soul to soul. It doesn't matter that the children are still alive, or say one of them died and the child is in Kamaloka. It doesn't matter. The mother is relating to the soul of the child, no matter where, on what plane that soul is expressing itself at the moment. If the child died also and is in Devachan, there is a communication on the Devachanic plane from soul to soul in the same way that it would be if the child is still on the physical plane. Now, it is obvious that if the mother had died and the mother would be aware of the physical plane, of what is going on with her children on the physical plane, the perfect happiness of Devachan would not be really possible, because whenever the children are suffering, the mother would be suffering for them, just as it happens when we all are on the physical plane. So the soul on the Devachanic plane is completely unaware of what happens on the physical plane. Again, for us that are so identified with the physical plane, we may think that this is a problem, that we are less aware when on Devachan than we are on the physical plane. But the physical plane is a dream for the soul. The physical plane, as real as it seems when we are incarnated, the physical plane is a plane of illusion, because all this suffering that we are talking about and that we experience so keenly is not really happening to the person, to the real in the person, to the soul. It's something that is happening to the body that the soul is animating. It's happening to the emotional body that the soul is animating, or to the mental body. And when we come back to our awareness as a soul, we recognize this reality, and there is a far less sense of, the problem of suffering. Perhaps in a certain way, it's just like we may see that somebody is playing a game, and that person may be upset at some point in the game, and we understand that it's a passing upset, provided that the person is mature enough that after the game is over can leave, everything behind. So when we see a game and we see the upset, we understand, well, it's just part of the game. The game is over, we go together, go watch a movie, eat, whatever we do, and that is finished. So the soul similarly, and when a soul, not in Devachan, because in Devachan the soul doesn't even know that there is a physical plane, but the soul, while we are incarnated, if we could raise our awareness to the level of the soul, we would realize how we see physical life from that perspective. And from that perspective, we see physical life just as this game, an important game. I mean, there are things that we learn, that we develop, but we understand that this is just a virtual reality in a sense. Now, when we come back to our physical brain, we forget that perspective, and then we are again clinging to whatever happens on the physical plane. So the soul in Devachan doesn't even know that there is a physical plane. The soul in Devachan, this is again why Devachan is still part of the illusion. In the same way that we don't know that Devachan exists, I mean, by means of these talks and study and all that, we can understand it intellectually, but we don't know it as an experience until we can raise our consciousness to that plane. So just as we don't know that we exist on those planes, the soul in Devachan doesn't know that there is an instance of existence on the physical plane. The soul is very happy relating to souls on the Devachanic plane that is, after all, our true home. Our experience on the physical plane is a very short passing experience. So this is why when the soul is in Devachan, is completely unaware of what may be happening on the physical plane, and that is fine. Now the question may be, well, but what happens so the person who died is useless to the people who are still on the physical plane? And Blavatsky wrote about this. She says, love beyond the grave, illusion though you may call it, has a magic and divine potency that reacts on the living. A mother's ego, the soul, filled with love for the imaginary, and in quotation marks, because this comes from a dialogue that she was having, where the person that was asking questions in this book, this is the key to Theosophy, was saying, but this is all happening in the imagination of the person. So Blavatsky was saying the love of the mother for the imaginary children that the soul sees near itself, living a life of happiness as real to it, to the soul, as when on earth, that love will always be felt by the children in flesh. It will manifest in their dreams and often in various events, in providential protections and escapes, for love is a strong shield and is not limited by space or time. So, as Annie Besant will explain, in Devachan, we are still generating actions These are actions on the mental plane, and those actions are still impacting the physical plane. So in the same way that in meditation, we may send love to people that may need help, and that love that does help people to some extent. It's far more difficult to send love from the physical plane to a person on the physical plane, because that love has to traverse a lot of physical matter. The impulse comes from the soul. It has to come to the brain. The brain has to produce a vibration. The other brain of the person has to receive that vibration. And then that vibration has to go to the mental body of the other person for the other person to have a certain perception of that. So there is like a long U-shape, path of vibrations that has to happen. When the love is being produced directly at the level of the soul, there is a direction communication from soul to soul, and from there it goes right down to the physical plane. So it's like a shortcut. So all this love that the mother is feeling for the children is being directed to the soul of the children, and that soul is perceiving it very clearly. Now, to what extent the children in their physical consciousness can perceive some of what they are feeling at the level of the soul, it depends on their sensitivity, how much connection there is between the soul and the brain, let's say. This is why I said at the beginning, we may have this sense of connection, this sense of presence, which is an echo of the soul. This is exactly what I was talking about. But not only that, the love of the mother, as Annie Besant is going to explain, is generating forces that can manifest on the physical plane, on the emotional plane, and on the mental plane. So she says, remembering that a thought becomes an active entity, these thought forms, capable of working good or evil, we easily see that as embodied souls can send to those they love helping and protecting forces. What I meant, in meditation, you can send these forces. So the Devachani, thinking of those dear to him, may send out such helpful and protective thoughts to act as a veritable guardian angels round his beloved on earth. Now, this happens automatically. It's not that the soul in Devachan is thinking of, the mother in Devachan, of her children on the physical plane. Again, the mother in Devachan has no idea that there is a physical plane. The whole reality of the mother is the plane of the soul. And the mother is relating to the soul of the kids, of the children. And that love that she's directing to the love of the children, and that relationship they are having on the plane of the soul, is also generating on the lower planes these thought forms, which will act on the physical personalities. So that's why Besant says, but this is very different, a very different thing from the spirit, or from thinking that the spirit of the mother is coming back to earth to be the almost helpless spectator of the child's woes. So you see, the activity in Devachan affects the physical plane. The feelings of the people on the physical plane affect the people in Devachan, especially the feelings of love and all of that. Feelings of sadness and regret and all of that cannot really reach a soul in Devachan. As we saw in the previous series, those feelings can reach the soul while the soul is in Kamaloka, because that is the plane of emotions and not necessarily spiritual. Anything can reach there. Once the soul goes to Devachan, only the feelings of love can reach the soul in Devachan. So Besant continues, to the Devachani then, the beloved are present in consciousness and full communication. the egos or souls being in touch with each other, though one is embodied and one is disembodied. We are giving this example of people who are still alive. The same happens if both of them are dead, or their bodies dead. However, she says, the higher consciousness of the embodied one rarely affects the brain. So this is what I was mentioning. Whatever is happening right now at the level of the souls, unless that person who is still embodied in a physical body has a close connection with the soul, that person is not aware at the level of the physical brain. This is part, to fully understand this, we need to understand the theosophical teachings about the constitution of a human being. We have different levels of consciousness, and we are aware on different levels of consciousness. Remember how the example I gave in our last class. Suppose you are playing a video game on the computer, and you can be playing a video game there, and you can be directing the character, making the character do this or that, but you are still aware of what is happening around you in your home where you are there, and you can switch your attention here and there. So in the same way, souls, even though they are incarnated, they are still aware as souls on their own plane. So the soul may be incarnated in one of these children, and at the same time, the soul is having a relationship with the soul of their mother that had died. So both things can happen at the same time. Now, that activity of the soul, as Annie Besant says, rarely can come in full awareness to the physical brain. So the awareness within the body doesn't realize what is happening outside of the body, let's say. Now, Besant says conscious communications with the Devachani can be received, or appearances, actually seeing an image of the Devachani can be seen if an embodied soul if a soul that is in a body that is alive is able to escape from its prison of flesh, rising to its sphere, to the sphere of the souls, or to come in rapport with it. So, as we are going to see, if we learn to leave our body, and I'm not talking about astral projection. Astral projection is simply being aware on the astral plane, which is not Devachan, it's lower than Devachan. So if we are on the astral plane, we are as unaware of the Devachanic plane as we are on the physical. If we can raise our consciousness to the Devachanic plane, then we can be aware, self-aware on that plane, and we can bring that memory to the physical plane. So there are different ways to do that, which are not part of the topic now, but Besant talks about quotes Blavatsky, who says, whenever years after the death of a person, his spirit is claimed to have wandered back to earth to give advice to those it loved, it is always in a subjective vision, in a dream or in a trance, in meditation, or however it is. And in that case, it is the soul of the living seer that is drawn to the disembodied spirit, and not the latter, which wanders back to our spheres. So some people, either because they have psychic sensitivity, because they can receive in the brain some connection or some of the things that are going on the Devachanic plane, when this happens, there is the sense that the soul is coming to talk to you. But this is an illusion. What is actually happening is that you are raising your consciousness to the plane of the soul, especially when the soul is in Devachan. When the soul is in Kamaloka, because the astral plane where Kamaloka is in direct contact with the physical, there are instances where the soul comes to the physical plane and communicates to the physical plane. In the Theosophical tradition, all those instances are in general quite negative for the soul. The soul has to keep moving on. But when the soul is in Devachan, there is no way for the soul again is not even aware that there is a physical plane. So all these communications are because we raised our consciousness to the Devachanic plane. And then we have a communication with, a loved one there that we can bring to our brain consciousness. Again, this communication is going on all the time. But when we can raise our center of awareness to that plane, then we can bring it back to the physical brain. So Besant says, so the incorporeal principles, the spiritual aspect of the pure sensitives, of people, they have to have a quality of purity that allows them to be aware on the Devachanic plane. Most psychics are aware only of on the astral plane. But when there is the case of a person that is pure enough, then the spiritual nature of that person can be placed in rapport, as Annie Besant says, with disembodied souls and have some kind of communication. Now, how reliable that communication is a different matter. This is a complex subject. We are going just to mention it. Besant says, although information thus obtained is not reliable usually, partly in consequence of the difficulty of transferring to the physical plane the impressions received, and partly from the difficulty of observing accurately when the seer is untrained. So in the Theosophical tradition, to be able to perceive correctly on the inner planes, you need a very specific yogic training to see correctly. Otherwise, sometimes you will see correctly, sometimes you won't. It's not that easy to perceive rightly on the inner planes because all our thoughts and emotions shape what we are seeing. Even on the physical plane, you may be walking and see a person that you know coming to you, and then when the person gets closer, you realize that it was not the person that you thought about, even though you saw the face of that person that you thought he or she was. So even on the physical plane, we can perceive something very, inaccurately. This is far more common on the inner planes. So many times, perceptions from the inner planes are a mixture of something real and a lot of our own projection. And there is a hard, long training to be able to perceive correctly. But that's not, our subject right now. The point is that we can, if we can raise our consciousness to those planes, then we can bring back the memory to the physical plane more or less accurately. And Besant says, normally communication when the body is sleeping is easier because we are already outside of the body when the body is asleep. It's easier than when it is awake. And a vivid dream of one on the other side of death is a real interview, is a real relationship with that person, whether in Kamaloka or in Devachan, depending where the person is. So many of these dreams that we have with people who have passed, they are actually memories of a real interaction. It's easier to have these dreams while the person is in Kamaloka because it's a plane that is closer. But this is also possible when the person is in Devachan, especially if we are able to raise our awareness to Devachan when the body is asleep. Okay, so this is part of the experience in Devachan in connection to people to whom their loved ones are basically the main interest in their lives. But there are many other people who, in addition to loving close friends and relatives, they are interested also in more impersonal, more global, more causes that have to do not just with my personal family, personal friends. So the experience in Devachan for people who generate this kind of causes is different. And the master, in the case of more personal individuals, the master wrote, the reward provided by nature for men who are benevolent in a large, systematic way, and who have not focused their affections on an individual or speciality, is that if pure, they pass the quicker for that through the Kama and Rupa lokas into the higher sphere of the Tribhuvana, which are the three worlds. Let me unpack that. Kama Loka is a place where we work out our personal feelings, actions, etc. All personal love that we may have to relatives, friends, etc., is normally a mix of unconditional love mixed with personal needs, personal things that we want from those we love. So normally personal love is mixed with all these elements. Therefore, when we go through Kamaloka on the astral plane, remember Kamaloka is like a place of purgation. We are detained there so that these two aspects, the unconditional love and the personal needs, expectations, demands, etc., they have to disentangle. And that takes some time. So when the expression of love that we have in a physical life is mostly through personal relationships, we are bound to have all these other personal elements mixed. So it will take a while for us to disentangle of them in Kamaloka. A person that has a more impersonal love, more unconditional love, is probably going to have far less of these personal feelings. So that person will be able to go through Kamaloka faster and wake up in Devachan faster, in the bliss of Devachan. But not only that, the master mentions here Rupa Loka. Devachan has two planes, let's say, or two aspects, the Rupa Loka and the Arupa Loka. The Rupa Loka, Rupa means form. Arupa means without form, from the Sanskrit words. So the Rupa Loka of Devachan is that state of Devachan that is produced by our more personal love. But there is a more abstract, a more spiritual aspect of Devachan, the Arupa Loka, where we are even closer to our true nature as a soul. And the experience in the Arupa Loka is deeper than the experience on the Rupa planes. In the Arupa Loka, we are with even less veils, less limitations from the previous personality. So a person that has a more universal love, a more universal interest, that person goes fast through Kamaloka. It stays in the Rupa Lokas for a while because that person may still have some personal affection, which that person will experience all that the things that we described to some extent. But remember that in this process, there is a natural tendency of the soul to get closer and closer to its true nature. The soul is trying to get to the highest that soul is able to conceive. So at some point, that level of personal experience, with our friends and families, is completely satisfied. And there are these more universal elements in us that make us go deeper into the Arupa Loka, where there is a more spiritual experience of Devachan. So a person for whom there are spiritual aspirations and love is not limited to their family. We have an experience at the level of family, and then we'll go deeper than that. As the master says here, we'll go through the Kamaloka and the Rupaloka into the higher sphere of these three worlds. That would be the Arupaloka, since it is one where the formulation of abstract ideas and the consideration of general principles fill the thought of its occupant. For most people, this more abstract state, if you cannot conceive a more universal interest, a more abstract interest, you wouldn't really appreciate that kind of devachan, and that's why you wouldn't have that kind of devachan. We will have the kind of devachan that we can appreciate, the highest that we can appreciate. So if in daily life we were not moved by more abstract principles like the suffering of humanity, not just the suffering of my children, the suffering of humanity, the pursuit of truth, not just knowing what to do, so what is the right action so that I can have a right relationship with my family and friends, but a more abstract pursuit of truth. You see, that's what the master means by abstract ideas, a more universal search. If you have that, then that will give you a more spiritual, a deeper, a more, it's hard to describe it in words, but let's just say a deeper experience in Devachan. And thus, the Devachani lives throughout long centuries an existence of unalloyed happiness, which is the reward for its sufferings in earth life, because Devachan has also this sense of reward for the sufferings and frustrations that the physical plane brings us. In short, it bathes in a sea of uninterrupted felicity, spanned only by events of still greater felicity in degree.